I apologize that our voting delayed us. That's the thing about being in the Senate. You do have to vote. It's really not optional. I want to begin by thanking each of our witnesses for being with us today. We know how difficult your jobs are, and they're even more challenging with recent developments on the border. I want to thank you for being willing to not only take on that task, but to share with us your insights into what's occurring along the border and any advice you may have for us on how to provide a solution. The situation unfolding on our southern border is grim. A major increase in unlawful border crossings combined with a drastic shift in migration trends and outdated laws and infrastructure has placed an incredibly great strain on law enforcement, on our legal system, and local border communities. In mid-March, Acting Secretary McAleenan, in his capacity as CBP Commissioner, warned us and the American public that the immigration system was near a breaking point. Since that time, a bad situation has gotten nothing but worse, bringing that breaking point to our doorstep. Yet, there are those who still here in Washington choose to ignore the gravity of the situation, or worse, to label it as fake or manufactured. At one point, there were elected officials who got into a debate about calling it a crisis versus an emergency. I really don't care how you label it. The entire system is breaking, and it is unsustainable. Facts, as they say, are stubborn things, so let's go over a few facts. In 2006, 90% of illegal border crossings were committed by single adults from Mexico, a vast majority of whom were repatriated back to their home country within hours. In fiscal year 2019 so far, more than 60% of those apprehended along the southern border have been either families or unaccompanied children. A vast majority of these individuals have traveled a long, dangerous journey from Central America. From March 2018 to March of this year, the U.S. Border Patrol apprehended more than 361,000 people along the southern border, a 108% increase compared to the same time period in fiscal year 2018. This represents a 106% increase in the Rio Grande Valley, a 174% increase in Yuma, and a 548% increase in the El Paso sector. During the same time period, the Border Patrol apprehended nearly 36,000 unaccompanied children, an increase of 66%. This represents an 82% increase in San Diego, a 124% increase in Del Rio, and a 333% increase in the El Paso sector. Finally, zeroing in on the biggest driver of the increase in illegal border crossings, family units. From October to March, the Border Patrol apprehended 189,584 families along the southern border, a 374% increase from the same time period in fiscal year 2018. This represents a 228% increase in the Rio Grande Valley, a 636% increase in Del Rio, and an astonishing 1,670% increase in the El Paso sector. In May and June of 2014, at the height of what President Obama then called a humanitarian crisis, approximately 135,000 people were apprehended at the southern border. In February and March of this year, again, a comparable two-month period, more than 180,000 were apprehended. Let me just repeat that. Back when President Obama called this a humanitarian and security crisis was when 135,000 people were apprehended. This year, February and March, 180,000 were apprehended. So obviously this trend is getting worse and worse. You'll notice that the statistics I cited today are current through March of 2019, and more than a month has passed since the American people received an update from Customs and Border Protection on the situation. It's my understanding that CBP has collected and analyzed the Southwest border apprehension data from April, and Chief Provost is prepared to present that data to us today. I look forward to hearing, I think, what has happened during the past month. A new phenomenon has also emerged, a rapid rise in the number of large groups of 100 people or more arriving at the border together, making the demanding jobs of agents on patrol all the more difficult. This was the most strikingly on display this last week when a group of more than 400 migrants presented themselves to the small town of Sunland Park, New Mexico, just across the border from El Paso, Texas. The increased apprehensions have led to crowded Border Patrol stations. In certain days over the last few months, CBP has had more than 14,000 people in their custody. Just yesterday, the Rio Grande Valley sector announced their stations and processing centers were holding more than 7,000 immigrants. That is for one Border Patrol sector, 7,000. CBP, Customs and Border Protection, simply does not have the facilities or resources to manage those kinds of numbers. CBP detention facilities are small, built for the short-term detention of single adults. During a recent television interview, Secretary McLennan accurately described these facilities as similar to police stations, yet some of them hold as many as 7,000 people. The current migrant surge of Central American children and families has stretched these facilities and the people who staff them beyond their abilities, beyond their capacity. With so many people to process and more manpower needed to process them, Border Patrol agents have been taken off the line, leaving areas of the border vulnerable to exploitation by human smugglers and drug cartels. And the CBP officers have been reassigned from their duties at international bridges and ports of entry, slowing legitimate commerce and travel. There should be no doubt that the drug cartels are using this situation to their advantage. CBP's seizures of meth, heroin, and cocaine are all on the rise. In response, in early April, then Secretary Nielsen created the Interagency Border Emergency Cell to determine how to best coordinate resources and appointed my friend Manny Padilla, who's with us today, to lead the effort. I look forward to hearing from him on the progress that was made. While some may think that the situation is manageable and that time is on our side, I think they're ignoring reality, and I disagree. And I know many of my constituents in Texas feel the same. We're on the front lines of this, and we're simply not set up, manned, nor do we have the capacity to absorb this huge wave of human migration coming in all at one time. In response to this worsening situation, last week I, along with my colleague from Laredo, Texas, Congressman Henry Cuellar, a Democrat, introduced the Humane Act. The Humane Act is, you can see, a bipartisan, bicameral solution to make the practical, necessary reforms to address the loopholes in our laws, ensure that families stay together, and better protect unaccompanied children released from HHS custody. We also adopt several recommendations from the bipartisan DHS Homeland Security Advisory Council, including the establishment of regional processing centers along the border and needed streamlining of processing claims. This legislation, to be sure, will not solve every problem, but it's a big step forward that would have a big impact and will bring some order out of the chaos. I urge on my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to work with us to try to solve this problem. We need to quit looking at this through a political lens or wait to try to solve what else is broken and needs to be fixed in our immigration system. This is an emergency situation, and only Congress can provide the authorization in order to allow our good men and women in Customs and Border Protection the resources they need in order to deal with this crisis. This problem will only continue to grow without our intervention, and obviously it requires compromise and cooperation. Finally, to the men and women of CBP, ICE, and ORR who are working around the clock in very difficult conditions to confront a worsening situation, I want to express my thanks and my gratitude on behalf of all of us. We sent them out into a losing battle unless we can work together here in Congress to give them the resources they need in order to do the job that we've asked them to do. I want to assure these dedicated men and women that we are trying, and I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. I look forward to your testimony. With that, I'll now recognize Senator Durbin, the ranking member, for any opening remarks he cares to make.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're having this hearing. Consider this. In fiscal year 2017, which included the end of the Obama administration and the beginning of the Trump administration, 303,000 people were apprehended at the border. 75,000, that included 75,000 families, 41,000 unaccompanied children. While only 2 months on the job, President Trump bragged about the results. On March 26, 2017, he tweeted, and I quote, "General Kelly's doing a great job at the border. Numbers are way down. Many are not even trying to come in anymore." Here we are 2 years later. The numbers are way up on President Trump's watch. Only 6 months into fiscal year 2019, only halfway into 2019, 361,000 people have already been apprehended at the border, including 189,000 family units and 36,000 unaccompanied children. That's more total apprehensions in the first half of this fiscal year than in the entire fiscal year 2017. So the president has changed his message. On March 7th, he tweeted, and I quote, "We are on track to apprehend more than 1 million people coming across the southern border this year. Can be fixed by Congress so easily and quickly if only the Democrats would get on board." So when the numbers were way down, the president took credit. But now that the numbers are up, it turns out it's the Democrats. Let's look at the facts. During less than 2.5 years of the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security has been in chaos. There have already been 4 different heads of the department: Secretary John Kelly, Acting Secretary Elaine Duke, Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, and now Acting Secretary Kevin McAleenan. And there have already been 4 acting directors of Immigration and Customs Enforcement in 2 years, and 3 nominees to head ICE. 1 year ago this week, on May 7th, 2018, then Attorney General Sessions announced a Get Tough policy, the full implementation of the administration's disastrous zero-tolerance policy, which led to the separation of at least 2,880 infants, toddlers, and children from their parents. Thanks to an investigation by the Inspector General that I requested, we now know that before that announcement, thousands more children may have been separated by this administration in pursuit of the policy before it was announced. Just 2 weeks ago, Federal District Court Judge Dana Sabrow from California ordered the administration to begin efforts to identify and reunite these families. This government-sanctioned zero-tolerance policy was a failure and, sadly, a sad commentary on America. The president was forced to reverse his position on this, and though he's hinted that he might return to it again, I pray that he won't. I went to an immigration court hearing last July in Chicago, in a high-rise in the Loop. The hallways were packed with people whose names were on the docket. I met the immigration court judge. She'd been at it for 18 years. I believe that she was a conscientious, professional, caring person. She was overwhelmed by the numbers facing her. She asked if I'd stay for the first 2 clients on the docket. The first one, she said, everyone should get in their chairs for this hearing. There's a difficulty. One of the clients couldn't get in her chair. You see, Marta was 2 years old. She needed to be lifted up and put in the chair and handed a stuffed animal. Hamilton, the 4-year-old boy, scrambled into his chair when he saw the Matchbox car on the table. That was the zero-tolerance policy. Those 2 children had been separated from their parents for months. Experts tell us that can have a lasting impact on a child's development. Luckily, we've abandoned that policy, and I hope we don't return to it in an effort to get tough. And let's not forget that earlier this year, the president forced the longest government shutdown in history in an effort to get Congress to pay for a wall that Mexico was supposed to build. The Trump shutdown paralyzed the very immigration courts I've just described and added to the backlog of cases. These courts play a critical role in processing cases of migrants seeking asylum. I wish we could hear from the Justice Department immigration judges about that backlog at some future hearing. The reality is the Trump administration's policies has made our borders less secure and many times undermined our American values. When the president threatens to shut down the border, it's like a neon sign that transporters, smugglers, and others use to encourage desperate families to flee as quickly as possible. I'd say to Chief Provost, I had a chance to visit on April 12th down at El Paso, and I want to thank all the people that I met and join with the chairman in saluting them. I want to especially thank the gentleman, the officer from the Border Patrol, the fact that he was from Chicago and a Cubs fan notwithstanding. He gave me a real insight into the challenge that the men and women of the Border Patrol are facing down there. But I can tell you this is not their doing, but the president's suggestion of cutting out all assistance to the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and shutting down avenues for legal migration just guarantees more refugees will flow to our border. I'm sorry we couldn't have the State Department here to tell us a little bit about that aspect of the challenge. The president has pulled off a rare unassisted triple play with this border policy. It's cruel, it's unpredictable, and it's ineffective. The administration and its allies in Congress argue that critical humanitarian protections are actually a magnet drawing vulnerable families and children to our country. They claim with a straight face that we can better protect these migrants by making it easier to detain them indefinitely and deport them without due process. But if people were migrating to the United States simply because of so-called legal loopholes, they would be coming from all over the region. Instead, more than 90% of the unaccompanied children come from 3 countries in the Northern Triangle. There's zero evidence to support the conclusion that repealing TVPRA and overturning the Flores settlement will actually deter migrants. In fact, the administration's already imposed numerous restrictions on asylum that have not deterred these desperate families and children. They don't address the root causes of why they're coming. Democrats are serious about this situation and believe we need to work together to solve it. In February, after the president finally ended his government shutdown, a number of us joined with the Republicans and wrote an omnibus appropriation bill. It included $564 million for inspection equipment at the ports of entry, a suggestion that came from now Acting Secretary McAleenan, and $414 million for humanitarian assistance, long overdue. We can do more to make sure, even in the midst of a political controversy, that our treatment of these desperate people reflects who we are as Americans. In the last Congress, Democrats introduced the Central America Reform and Enforcement Act as a comprehensive response. I'm announcing that next week we'll reintroduce it. It'll address the root causes in the Northern Triangle, crack down on cartels and traffickers, provide for in-country processing of refugees so they don't have to make the trek across Mexico, expand third country resettlement in Mexico and other Central American countries, and eliminate the immigration court backlog. We stand ready as Democrats to work with the Republicans and the president on smart, effective, and humane border security policies. I hope that we can do this together.
Senator Graham, I understand, may be coming, but at this time I'll recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Senator Feinstein, for any comments she'd care to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for scheduling today's hearing, and I welcome all the witnesses here today. I don't think I need to tell anyone, judging from this full room, that we face a challenge at the border today. Fewer are crossing illegally than in the late 1990s, when well over 1 million people crossed every year. But the number of families seeking asylum is high and continuing to climb. We need humanitarian and common sense solutions to address these asylum claims fairly and promptly. But as I understand it, the administration is threatening to make the problem worse, not better, by threatening to build a wall and shut down lawful border commerce. I'd like to ask each of you about these issues today. Our first challenge is that vulnerable families and children are arriving in the United States seeking protection from violence and poverty. The administration wants to address this challenge by repealing essential legal protections for children and by reinstituting the cruel practice of family separation. I believe this is the wrong approach. Instead, we have to increase the capacity of our backlogged immigration court system. We must ensure that our ports of entry can accommodate families and children safely. so these vulnerable people are not forced to cross between ports or languish in Mexico for months. And we have to do this without separating families and without sacrificing key protections for children. We've seen what family separation accomplishes. Babies and toddlers crying out for their parents, children and alone in cages. This is contrary to basic American values, and that's why I introduced a bill to prohibit family separation without good cause. This bill now has over 40 co-sponsors, and I'd like to invite all Democrats and Republicans to join. We've seen that CBP separated thousands of children from their family, and many of these families remain apart today, over 2 years later. I'm very pleased that we have witnesses from both CBP and HHS to explain the identification techniques and reunification plans for separated families. But meanwhile, prolonged detention of children has resulted in tragedy. 2 children died in CBP custody last winter, and just last week, an unaccompanied child died while in the care of HHS. Congress has provided Border Patrol with over $400 million to care for children, but the Homeland Security Advisory Council still says it's unrealistic to place a pediatrician at each border station. So I hope you will explain why $400 million is insufficient to provide adequate pediatric care. These humanitarian issues, to many of us, and I hope a majority of us, are serious and need solving. I'm going to put, Mr. Chairman, the rest of I know there's a large audience and many members here, which is just great because this is important, and I'll put the rest of my statement in the record.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Our first witness is Chief Carla Provost. Chief Provost is Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Before her current position, she served in a number of capacities within the Border Patrol, including as Field Operations Supervisor in the Tucson sector, Chief Border Patrol Agent for the El Centro sector, Chief Patrol Agent for the El Paso sector, and Assistant Chief Patrol Agent in the Yuma sector. Our next witness is Mr. Todd Owen. Mr. Owen is currently the Executive Assistant Commissioner in the Office of Field Operations. This includes managing a budget of $5.2 billion for operations at CBP's ports of entry and other national security operations. Prior to his current role at CBP, Mr. Owen served as the Director of Field Operations for the Los Angeles Field Office. His responsibilities extended to the greater Los Angeles area, including the Los Angeles and Las Vegas international airports. Our third witness is Natalie Asher. Ms. Asher currently is the Acting Executive Associate Director of Enforcement and Removal Operations for the Department of Homeland Security. In this role, she's tasked with identifying, arresting, removing those aliens who present a danger to national security or public safety. Prior to her current position, she served in the U.S. Army as a Russian linguist and military intelligence analyst. Our next witness is Mr. Jonathan Hayes, who's currently Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the Department of Health and Human Services. Prior to his current role, Mr. Hayes served as Chief of Staff at ORR, and before joining HHS, Mr. Hayes served as Chief of Staff to 2 members of the House of Representatives. Our final witness is Mr. Manny Padilla. Mr. Padilla is currently the Director of the DHS Joint Task Force West, where he is tasked with improving information sharing and coordination for CBP and ICE. From early April until last year, Director Padilla was appointed by the Secretary of Homeland Security to lead the Interagency Border Emergency Cell. Director Padilla has also served as Sector Chief of the Border Patrol's Rio Grande Valley sector. Thank you all for joining us today, and if you would please stand, I will administer the oath. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Have a seat. Well, I guess different people hear different messages, but one of the messages I hear is good luck. You're not going to get any help from Congress. It's all President Trump's fault. So you don't have to agree or disagree with what I just said, but I hope you will tell us in an unvarnished and factual way exactly what you are seeing, and based on your experience at the border, what Congress needs to do. I'm not talking about what President Trump needs to do or what anybody else needs to do, but I'm asking you to tell us what Congress needs to do in order to give you the tools you need in order to do your job. Chief Provost, I'll recognize you first for your opening statement.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, and members of the subcommittee. I could not be prouder to be here today representing the men and women of the Border Patrol. I joined the Border Patrol nearly 25 years ago because of my strong belief in our border security mission. I could never have envisioned that today agents would spend at least 40% of their time as child care professionals, medical caregivers, bus drivers, and food service workers. Time and time again, my agents continue to go above and beyond. Just a few weeks ago, agents rescued a 3-year-old boy abandoned by smugglers in a cornfield with only his name and his parents' phone number written on his shoes. Agents have rescued more than 2,200 migrants endangered by ruthless smugglers so far this year. As we sit here today, thousands more are being encouraged to bring or send their children to our border based on smugglers' false promises of a safe and easy journey. Our apprehension numbers are off the charts compared to recent years. As of April 30th, we apprehended 460,294 people on the southern border. In the last week, we had our highest single day, over 5,200 apprehensions, and our single largest group of 421 illegal aliens. As of Sunday, only 7 months into the year, we have now surpassed the total southwest border apprehensions of every fiscal year since 2009. The number of family units and unaccompanied children has skyrocketed to 64% of southern border apprehensions. So far this year, we've apprehended 248,197 family unit aliens and 44,779 UACs. These populations present significant challenges, not only because of the additional care they require, but because our immigration system treats them differently than single adults. For the first time in Border Patrol history, nearly half of the adults we apprehended in April brought children. They have received the message loud and clear: bring a child, you will be released. In April, we apprehended an average of 2,400 families and children each day, and ICE and HHS lack the capacity to keep up. Since March 19th, Border Patrol has been forced to directly release processed non-criminal family units from locations that are dangerously over capacity, 33,000 people to date. Though we are adding new soft-sided and modular facilities in El Paso, Rio Grande Valley, and Yuma sectors, our short-term holding facilities are still beyond capacity. To address the volume, we've detailed agents from the northern and coastal borders and received assistance from our brothers and sisters in OFO. Even with additional manpower, my field commanders have had to pull agents off the border, reduce task force participation, postpone training, and close checkpoints. We cannot address this crisis by simply shifting more resources or building more facilities. It's like holding a bucket under a faucet. It doesn't matter how many buckets you give me if we can't turn off the flow. To address the flow of illegal immigration, there must be consequences for illegally crossing the border. I've said before, this is both a humanitarian and a border security crisis. But as we focus our resources on the immediate humanitarian needs, we have been forced to put the nation's security at risk. We have apprehended more than 3,500 people with gang affiliation and criminal histories so far this fiscal year, and assaults on my agents are up more than 20%. Single adult apprehensions have reached a 5-year high, 167,318 so far this fiscal year. Of the 3 demographic groups, we have the greatest ability to deliver consequences to single adults, knowing that these individuals actively seek to evade law enforcement. Every agent that I pull off the line to process and care for families and children increases the risk that illegal border crossers will get past us, including those smuggling drugs and other contraband. We need to know who and what is crossing our border, but that is nearly impossible when our manpower is diverted. Cocaine seizures this year have far exceeded last year's total. In January, we seized more than 700 pounds of cocaine being smuggled across the Rio Grande while agents were occupied with large groups of families nearby. And I worry how much more is getting past us. Simply put, we have been forced to put our border security and our national security at risk. ICE is quickly running out of space to detain adults during their immigration proceedings. My greatest concern is that we will have to begin releasing single adults. We must maintain the ability to deliver consequences, or we will lose control of the border. My men and women are doing everything they can to meet this challenge, but Border Patrol cannot do this alone. Our nation cannot solve today's crisis using yesterday's legal framework. This outdated framework has not only tied our hands, but has driven hundreds of thousands of people to risk their lives on the dangerous journey to our border. Smuggling organizations have built an entirely new line of business around these families and children. It is highly lucrative and provides a distraction that helps them cash in on other illicit activities. When my agents are working on the border, they know that smugglers and their scouts are watching their every move. Rest assured, they are watching what we do here in Washington, and they are banking on inaction. Crisis is the word so many are now using to describe the border, but now we need more than words. It's time to act. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Owen?
Good afternoon, Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, members of the subcommittee. It's my honor to testify before you today on behalf of U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Office of Field Operations, which is responsible for the lawful ports of entry in the United States. My testimony this afternoon will focus specifically on the current situation we are experiencing along our southwest border with Mexico. As America's unified border security agency, CBP has 4 priority missions: national security, counter-narcotics, economic security, and the facilitation of lawful trade and travel. Every day along our southwest border with Mexico, over 535,000 travelers enter the United States through one of the 42 lawful border crossings. Each day, 215,000 privately owned vehicles, 450 commercial buses, and 2,100 commercial trucks and rail cars arrive from Mexico. Each of these pathways presents differing levels of risk to our national security, our public safety, and our economic prosperity. The volumes of crossing that we see each day along our southern border ports of entry, along with outdated and inadequate facilities, presents clear operational challenges for our field leadership. Decisions must be made daily on how best to allocate personnel, technology, and financial resources to address the risk present in the uncertain environment. In recent months, we have seen unprecedented and unsustainable trends in our daily operation that make it more difficult for our officers to carry out their priority missions. Undocumented migrants, sometimes traveling in groups numbering in the hundreds, are arriving at southwest border crossings seeking to make entry. The majority are family units and unaccompanied alien children, many of them claiming fear of returning to their countries of origin. The sheer numbers presenting themselves at the ports have exceeded our processing and temporary detention capacity, while diverting our officers away from other duties, such as narcotics interdiction and facilitating lawful trade and travel. And let me be clear, our officers are committed to processing each individual in a humane and efficient manner. But the current border security and humanitarian crisis at our southwest border has ripple effects that impact the entire nation. At the end of March, we reassigned 545 CBP officers from throughout the country, from airports, seaports, the southwest border, and the northern border, to support our Border Patrol colleagues. This week, as the crisis continues unabated, the Border Patrol has asked for an additional 186 officers to assist, for a total of 731 CBP officers pulled from the ports of entry. The temporary reassignment of CBP officers to assist the Border Patrol is absolutely necessary, as we must help the patrol as they respond to the record high level of illegal crossings and apprehensions. But the reassignment of officers from the ports of entry to the Border Patrol facilities comes with consequences. Pedestrian, passenger vehicle, commercial truck crossings trying to cross the border are experiencing uncharacteristically long delays. Some ports of entry have been forced to close some travel lanes and curtail some weekend cargo processing hours. As officers are pulled from ports nationwide, we may begin to experience extended wait times at our airports and northern border as we head into the busy summer travel season. The negative impacts extend beyond the facilitation of trade and travel. More concerning to me is the impact we are seeing on our narcotics interdiction efforts on the southwest border ports of entry. At the ports of entry, our seizures of hard narcotics like heroin and fentanyl so far in FY19 are down. We're seeing significant increases between the ports as the Border Patrol agents are directed to assist with the humanitarian crisis. In FY17, when crossings of undocumented migrants were at 40-year lows, we experienced a 34% increase in hard narcotic seizures along our southwest border over the previous year. Each officer and agent pulled off the front line to process, detain, and care for undocumented migrants has a direct impact on CBP's interdiction of hard narcotics flowing into our communities. This fact must not be lost, which is why the current migration situation along the southwest border must be viewed as not only a humanitarian crisis, but a national security crisis as well. I appreciate the support Congress has offered our men and women on the front lines. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Owen. Ms. Asher?
Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Natalie Asher, and I am the Acting Executive Associate Director for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Removal Operations. As a career law enforcement officer with more than 2 decades of experience, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the current humanitarian and security crisis at the southern border, as well as ICE's critical mission of protecting the homeland and ensuring the integrity of our nation's immigration system through the enforcement of our immigration laws. Today, unprecedented numbers of migrants continue to illegally cross the border or present themselves at ports of entry without documentation. These numbers are on the rise, straining our entire immigration system, stretching resources thin across the Department of Homeland Security, and causing ICE to balance its public safety mission in the interior of the United States with the influx of migrants at the border. In the past, the vast majority of illegal migrants were single male adults from Mexico who could be quickly and effectively returned. Beginning with the initial surge in FY 2014, there has been a significant increase in the arrival of both family units and unaccompanied alien children across the southern border, a trend which continues with no end in sight. Now, over 60% of those seeking to cross the border are family units and UACs, most of whom are from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In fact, since December 21st, 2018, ICE has released approximately 168,000 family members directly into the United States, as current laws and court rulings essentially mandate the immediate release of these family members, many of whom are never heard from again. These family units and UAC add to our already overburdened immigration system and contribute to the growing immigration court backlog, which has now surpassed 800,000 cases. 2 of ICE's greatest challenges are limited detention beds for adults and the inability to detain family units for the length of time necessary for their cases to be decided, in large part due to the Flores settlement agreement and judicial decisions that interpret it. The record numbers of CBP apprehensions at the border impact our interior enforcement efforts because congressional funding limits the number of adult beds available to ICE. Since many recent border crossers are subject to mandatory detention under the Immigration and Nationality Act, their arrival leaves limited detention capacity for those who are arrested in the interior of the country, including those with criminal records. Additionally, since ICE can typically only hold family units for approximately 20 days due to the Flores and the judicial decisions interpreting it, most members of this population remain non-detained with little or no oversight. Although ICE has sought to deal with the rapid increase in this population through additional strategies, such as the Alternatives to Detention program, this has proven ineffective in the management of recently arriving aliens, as absconder rates are much higher for this group, most of whom have no existing ties to the community and may not know their final geographic destination. Ultimately, without the necessary authority to enable ICE to detain family units for the duration of their immigration proceedings, without the proper ability to hold those accountable who fail to comply with ATD or release conditions, and without sufficient resources to apprehend those who abscond, this situation will result in virtual impunity for those who violate our immigration laws, and the flow of aliens into the United States will continue, if not increase. Unfortunately, the release of family units before the conclusion of immigration proceedings has led to these individuals failing to appear for court hearings, as well as failing to comply with removal orders. Additionally, legislation like the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act has left gaps in our immigration laws that are exploited by transnational criminal organizations and human smugglers. These gaps encourage parents to send their children on the dangerous journey north, and we have found that they incentivize smugglers to place children into the hands of adult strangers so that they can pose as families and be released from immigration custody. Fraudulent family claims are a significant problem, and DHS must have the ability to protect the best interest and welfare of minors involved in potential smuggling or trafficking situations. The record numbers of aliens arriving at our border indicate that these gaps have created an enormous pull factor. Amendments to the laws and immigration court processes that I have outlined in my written testimony are needed to help ensure the successful repatriation of aliens ordered removed by an immigration judge. Now more than ever, ICE must have the necessary authorities to ensure the safe and successful repatriation of persons who have had their day in court and been ordered removed in accordance with our immigration laws. Without the necessary funding and legislative changes, the integrity of our immigration system will continue to be undermined. Thank you again and for your support of ICE, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Asher. Mr. Hayes.
Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, and members of the subcommittee, it is my honor to appear on behalf of the Department of Health and Human Services. My name is Jonathan Hayes, and as the Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, I manage the Unaccompanied Alien Children Program. I became the permanent director earlier this year, and it is a privilege to serve in this role alongside our dedicated ORR career staff. Prior to my time at ORR, I worked for 2 congressional members for approximately 8 years. That experience provided me with firsthand knowledge of the important oversight role that you and your staff have to ensure that the federal programs operate successfully. As I manage the program, my goals are to ensure the safety and well-being of the children in ORR's care in a manner that is consistent with the law, and to make decisions that are in the best interest of each child. ORR facilities offer a variety of placement setting options, such as foster care and group homes. These options allow ORR to accommodate each child's unique circumstances when deciding where to place a child. UAC shelters provide housing, nutrition, routine medical care, mental health services, educational services, and recreational activities. A network of grantees operate the facilities, which are licensed by state authorities. The exception is ORR's temporary hard-sided influx care facility in Homestead, Florida. That facility is not required to obtain state licensure. However, children who reside at this location receive the same standard of care and services as those provided by a permanent state licensed facility. As of March 30th of this year, DHS has already referred approximately 32,284 unaccompanied children to ORR. If this rate continues in fiscal year 2019, ORR will care for the largest number of unaccompanied children in the program's history. Based on the anticipated growth pattern in referrals, HHS is preparing for the need for high bed capacity to continue. Currently, HHS maintains approximately 14,000 beds. On May 1st, the administration transmitted to Congress a supplemental request for an additional $2.9 billion for HHS, which would enable ORR to increase shelter capacity to 23,600 beds. Without additional funding, there is a significant likelihood that the UAC program will exhaust all of its resources by this June, in which case HHS may need to reallocate more funds from refugees and victims of torture and scale back services. In the worst case scenario, thousands of children might remain for lengthy periods of time in DHS facilities rather than being expeditiously transferred to HHS. In an effort to improve coordination and information sharing, HHS and DHS have entered into 2 agreements over the past year. First, in April 2018, HHS, ICE, and Cbp entered into an information sharing memorandum of agreement. The agreement requires ICE and Cbp to provide ORR with information pertaining to gang membership and criminal history. Second, in July of 2018, ORR published a joint concept of operations with DHS to address overlapping responsibilities. The JCO covers existing policies, procedures, and protocols related to transportation, processing, and the care of unaccompanied children. Since June 2018, when the President issued Executive Order 13841 and the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of California issued its orders in the Miss L case, HHS staff have worked tirelessly to reunify children separated from their parents. In order to identify all possible children in the Miss L class, HHS conducted a rigorous forensic data review to identify indicators of potential separation for every child in ORR care as of June 26, 2018. Through its exhaustive data review, HHS identified 2,814 children of potential class members. Of the 2,814 children reported to the Miss L court, ORR has reunified 2,162 children with their parents. Another 597 children have left ORR care through other appropriate discharges, such as a release to a sponsor who is a family member. Further review found that 9 children had not been separated. And for the remaining children, some cannot be reunified with their parent because ORR has determined that the parent meets the criteria for exclusion from the class or is not eligible for reunification. In addition, some parents have waived reunification. On April 25, 2019, the court approved the government's proposed plan to identify the children who were referred to and discharged from ORR custody between July 1, 2017 and June 25, 2018, and who were separated by DHS from their parents at some point in the process. That plan is underway now, and we anticipate meeting the court's deadline within 6 months. In conclusion, the UAC program provides quality care and services to unaccompanied children every day. ORR's work is driven by child welfare principles. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our important work, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Mr. Padilla.
Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Manuel Padilla, Jr., and I am the director of the Joint Task Force West. That's part of the Department of Homeland Security's Southern Border and Approaches campaign. I was born on the U.S.-Mexico border and grew up in a border community. I joined the Border Patrol when I was 20 years of age and have been working at different levels and locations along the border for more than 32 years now. I know the southwest border from a personal and professional perspective. Throughout the years, I have seen illegal immigration and cross-border crime evolve extensively. I have seen large numbers of illegal migrants and narcotics traffickers crossing the border highway into U.S. neighborhoods and schools in El Paso in 1993. I have seen the horrific aftermath of cartel violence as criminal groups battle for control in certain parts of the border. I have seen people that criminal organizations have brutally beaten or left behind to die. I have seen migrants thrown into the Rio Grande to distract pursuing agents. However, I have never seen the conditions that we are currently experiencing on the southwest border. The influx of family units and unaccompanied children has increased exponentially. CBP's holding facilities and ICE's detention facilities are beyond capacity. Officers and agents are stretched to their limit. Today, we are contending with an unprecedented humanitarian and border security crisis, and a crisis situation demands a crisis response. On April 2nd, 2019, former DHS Secretary Nielsen created the Interagency Border Emergency Cell, or the IBEC. The purpose of the IBEC was to coordinate the government's resource response to the crisis on the border. This is not without precedent. DHS will often stand up coordination cells in times of disaster, such as responding to a hurricane or a wildfire. The analogy between the migration crisis and a hurricane is not far off. Both create significant humanitarian demands, including food and shelter. Both require a whole-of-government approach, and both have wide-ranging effects outside the immediate point of impact. In the case of migration, that includes increased wait times for legitimate trade and travel and an overall degradation of our national security mission. I was selected to lead the department's resource coordination efforts in addressing this crisis. Our first order of business was to get resources down to the front line. That included transportation, health and medical, food, water, and shelter resources, as well as security and legal resources. We began by looking internally at our resources within the Department of Homeland Security. We issued a call for volunteers within the department to deploy to the southwest border to help our frontline officers and agents. There are a number of non-law enforcement roles for volunteers to play, from driving transportation vehicles to preparing food and caring for children. And every role filled by a volunteer helps us get badges back to the border. We also looked beyond DHS and to the Interagency for support. For example, we reached out to the U.S. Marshals Service and Federal Bureau of Prisons to help provide vehicles for our transportation needs. We also asked the Department of Defense for support in the form of lawyers, drivers, and general purpose to assist in other areas. It is critical to understand that the IBEC coordination of resources is focused on managing the crisis that the men and women are in the front lines are dealing with in a heroic manner. Unfortunately, these resources will not mitigate the increasing flow of migrants that is causing the crisis. In other words, these are Band-Aid fixes to a worsening situation. The IBEC was not intended to exist in perpetuity. We are transitioning our mission to the DHS Joint Incident Advisory Group. We were simply the start of the necessary all-hands-on-deck response to the migration crisis on our southwest border. There is one very, very important difference between this crisis and a hurricane. Hurricanes end, and recovery can then begin. With a migration crisis, there is no end in sight. Our country's existing legal framework will continue to draw massive numbers of migrants from Central America and other parts of the world. We do not have the facilities to shelter them, nor is there an efficient way to return them to their respective countries. This is until our laws change. The hurricane will continue on until there's fundamental change to our laws. The only one who can stop the storm is the Congress of the United States, and I implore the men and women of this subcommittee to acknowledge the crisis and take action. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Padilla. We'll do 5-minute rounds of questions for the witnesses. Chief Provost, a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times ran a story about a 3-year-old child unaccompanied by an adult that the Border Patrol found at the border. How in the world would a 3-year-old child make their way from Central America to the U.S.-Mexico border, and why would anybody send them? Why would any parent or family member send them unaccompanied to the United States?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Yes, that's a tough case, and the young man is in good care with HHS now, and we made sure that we got him new clothes, and he was watching movies at the station. But that one was a tough one, to see him abandoned out in a cornfield. The smugglers, as I said, this is illicit business for them. They're making money off of this. They are pushing families, saying that they can either get the families or they can get their children here.
And these smugglers know that under the Flores decision, the U.S. government can't hold a child in detention longer than 20 days, correct?
That is correct, and from interviews that we have done with the families that we have been apprehending, they are hearing that message loud and clear. They are hearing that from the smugglers. They are hearing it through media down in the Northern Triangle as well. So therefore, and they don't understand the risk and the dangers that the trip is going to bring, I don't believe.
Well, let's talk about that a minute. Do you know how many children are sent from Central America to the United States who die en route?
We have, as you know, Senator, we rescue, and we've rescued over 2,200. We have seen numerous deaths to include
those are
children.
only the ones who make it to the
That's correct.
border, correct?
So we have also come across numerous individuals that are deceased. That being said, that does not account for those that die along the way.
How about the
along
women and
journey.
children who are sexually assaulted en route? Is it true that the U.S. government performs birth control examinations or tests on 10-year-old girls?
I have never heard of that happening, so I can't speak to the birth control tests. I can speak to the sexual assaults, though, and that we are having young women and young men report being sexually assaulted along their journey.
If you come as a young girl, let's say a minor child from Central America to the Mexican border, what are your chances of being sexually assaulted en route? Do you have any statistics or any numbers for us?
I don't have an exact number, but I would say that particularly if they are coming alone, that it is certainly of high risk.
And do you have instances where adults claim to be a parent or family member of a child, and that ends up being a false? The child ends up being a ticket used by that adult to try to exploit this temporary detention provision in American law?
We are seeing that. Fiscal year to date, we've already identified 3,500 fraudulent families, and fraud is for various reasons, but we have seen instances where children are certainly being exploited along the way, and we are working with our partners at ICE HSI as well to try to identify as many of those as possible. The welfare of these children are of our utmost concern.
And these problems are going to continue and maybe get worse unless Congress acts. Is that part of your message for us today?
I would tell you that they will continue to get worse based on the numbers that we are seeing. As the numbers continue to increase, Border Patrol alone nearly apprehended 100,000 people this last month. 98,977. That was just Border Patrol apprehensions in the month of April.
I don't believe anybody in Congress would ask our men and women in the United States military to fight our nation's wars without making sure that they were trained and equipped in order to do that. But I do believe that Congress is sending our men and women in the Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection into a different kind of battle and denying you the authorities that only Congress can provide to give you the tools you need in order to do your job. Mr. Owen, let me tell you about a meeting I had recently from some constituents who happen to be engaged in businesses along the border and in the heartland, manufacturing business. As you know, there's manufacturing supply chains that require cross-border traffic, places like Laredo, McAllen, El Paso. They even told me that in order to meet the demands of the supply chain for manufacturing process, they had to fly parts from Juarez to El Paso. They said it's about an 11-minute flight, but they can't get across the border because of the phenomenon you described, which is lanes being closed down to legal commerce and traffic, and CBP agents being reassigned to deal with handing out diapers and juice boxes to children. Can you confirm that and tell us, is this a threat to the U.S. economy?
Yes, sir, absolutely. When the Border Patrol put out their call for assistance at the end of March, where they were completely overwhelmed, completely overwhelmed with what they were seeing, we provided 545 officers directly from the southwest border ports that are most capable to respond immediately. So they had an urgent need. We provided officers who were in the immediate area. We pulled 300 officers out of the Laredo area, 194 out of the El Paso area, and 51 out of the San Diego area. That immediate response to assist the Border Patrol did result in significant wait times, both commercially and in our passenger vehicles as well. Typical wait times would be 1 to 2 hours. We were seeing 5 to 7 hour wait times for cargo coming across. After that initial call for assistance came out, we were able to begin to readjust those 545 officers from the southwest border with replacements from our airports, our seaports, our northern border, in alliance with our collective bargaining agreement we have from the union. So eventually we were able to get that balance down. Right now it's about 245 officers from the southwest border that are assisting and 300 from the airports, the seaports, and the northern border that are assisting. That has brought the wait times back down, still higher than what we typically have seen before, but much better than what we saw at the end of March.
What are you going to do when instead of 100,000 migrants a month, you see 200,000 or 300,000,
very
400,000?
Very concerning as the Border Patrol needs more assistance and they turn to us to provide that assistance, we'll be pulling more officers out of our airports, our seaports, our northern border. That is where the majority of our staff is. And we enter our busy summer travel season next month. So there could be ripple effects throughout the economy, throughout our summer travel, if this situation continues.
Thank you. Senator Durbin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Some spokesmen, and perhaps even the President, have claimed that only 3% of asylum seekers and 2% of immigrants attend immigration courts. Can anyone here shed any light on the statistics that have been used? Kirsten Nielsen said as secretary, asylum seekers more than not fail to appear in immigration court. Have any of you heard that?
So, thank you, Senator. What I can tell you is that better? What I can tell you is that the overwhelming majority of individuals, particularly the family members who are coming across, in fact, are not attending even their first hearings. The situation that we have, just sort of piggybacking on the ripple effect of the sheer volume of individuals coming across. I don't have the capacity, as you well know, to house family members beyond what is restricted there in Texas.
So I hate to interrupt you, but I've got to stop this right now. In fiscal year 2018, the Department of Justice figures show 89% of all asylum applicants attended their final court hearing to reach a decision on their application. When families and unaccompanied children have access to legal representation, the rate of compliance with immigration court obligations is 98%. Now, does that sound like 2% or 3%? It isn't even close. And if we found that if there's any case management and counseling, so they understand the legal process, they're going to show up in numbers over 95%. They want to have an adjudication. They're hoping they can stay here legally. But this 2 or 3% catch and release, we'll never see them again. The Department of Justice says that isn't true. I think we've got to start with some basic facts that we can agree on here. And this is not a Democratic National Committee press release. This is from the Department of Justice. Let me ask this question if I can. Chief Provost, you've been on the job for a few years. Do you mind telling us how long your career's been?
25 years with the Border Patrol.
Okay. I don't say that in any way to denigrate you, but to celebrate your service to our government. Thank you. So you talked about the faucet and the bucket.
Yep.
And what you basically said is until you turn the faucet off, we just can't keep up with this.
Yes, sir.
I would suggest to you that you're looking at the same faucet today that you looked at 2 years ago and 5 years ago. In other words, TVPRA, the Flores decision, our standards for asylum are internationally accepted standards, credible threats, credible fear. So the faucet's the same. The question is, why is more water flowing through the faucet? And I think you have to go beyond the obvious laws to ask, what are the circumstances that are driving more water through this faucet? What has changed from 2 years ago that we're having dramatic increases? And that's where I think we have to step in. You can tell us the results of it and what you face every day, and I've seen it firsthand, at least my one visit. I don't profess to be an expert, but I saw pretty graphically what was going on in El Paso. What's going on in 3 countries in our hemisphere is dramatically different than it was just a few years ago. And people are doing things that were unthinkable a few years ago. And there are lots of explanations. Our drug consumption, the drug money we send back down south to these cartels, the guns that come out of gun shows in the United States to arm these cartels. Part of that is a cycle of violence and disruption that leads to these people being terrorized in countries with very flimsy, if any, governments. So when we talk about policies, the faucet looks the same as it did 2 years or 5 years ago, but the water flowing through it is coming from an unusual source in a different way. Please respond.
Senator, you're discussing the push and pull factors of why these individuals are coming here. Now, I would say that it is not quite the same in the aspect of the demographic has changed dramatically. And as I stated before, single adults are the only demographic that we can deliver a consequence to now.
But the law hasn't changed. Has it?
Actually, well, when it comes to detaining families, yes, because of the Flores
How
settlement
long is
agreement.
that? How long has the Flores settlement been out?
Since late 2015, I think.
So we've had 4 years or 5 years,
And
now
since then, our
it's-
numbers of family units have skyrocketed once they realized that we could not detain children longer than 20 days.
Do you have any confidence that if we took these unaccompanied children and returned them to any of these countries, if they're arguing that they're being terrorized and threatened with death by gangs, that they would be protected in those countries?
I think the issue, Senator, is that we don't have the opportunity to even afford them that if they are not a contiguous
I'm just
country.
hypothetically, because that's one of the solutions being proposed by the administration. Send them back where they came from. So I'm asking the obvious question. Let's assume that someone has said, I'm going to rape your daughter if you're not complicit with this gang. And you've said, I want my daughter out of here. Now the daughter's being returned after this perilous journey to the United States, and she didn't qualify, and she's being sent back. So what assurance do we have of her safety once she returns?
We always ensure the safety of children first, and that in this scenario
in your
that
care and custody, correct?
that is correct.
But I'm asking if the argument has been, just like Mexican children, we're going to return Honduran children back to Honduras. What assurance do we have that there's going to be anyone in Honduras to care for them and make certain they're safe?
That the same standards have to be applied that we do with Mexican nationals. We don't just turn any child back to Mexico. They have to be able to make a determination, meaning that the child has to be old enough to make a decision. We reach out to Mexican immigration. It would have to be similar in relation to dealing with whether it's Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador. But the fact that we don't even have that ability to do that today is the issue that is at hand. We need to have the ability to have that as an option.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy.
Am I saying your name right? Padilla?
Yes, Senator Padilla.
Padilla.
Yes, sir.
Has it been your experience that 80+% of folks entering our country illegally show up for their court date?
The reports that I have seen is that about 12% actually qualify at the end of the process for asylum. The great majority do not qualify
Right.
for asylum, but the screening up front is very lenient.
But what about the number of people who come in, claim asylum, are turned loose? What percentage you think, based on your experience, actually show up for their court date?
Yes, I cannot answer that categorically, but what I can tell you is that one of the main drivers for the populations that we're seeing right now is the organized crime is very, very knowledgeable of our laws.
Yes, sir. I guess what confuses me is if everybody shows up for their court date, how come we have 11 million people in our country illegally? Those numbers don't make sense to me. And I'd like to ask Attorney General Barr if he can do this when he's under a contempt citation, to ask whoever put together those numbers at Justice to take another run at it. I'm not saying my good friend Senator Durbin is wrong. He's citing justice figures. That just doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand how we got 11 million folks here in our country who are here in violation of the law if they all showed up for their court date. Let me shift gears here. What troubles me about this whole debate, well, let me preface it with a question. Mr. Hayes, is illegal immigration illegal?
So the mission of Health and Human Services.
Is illegal immigration illegal?
The mission of Health and Human Services is to not enforce immigration laws. Our role is to simply care for the children that are referred to us, sir.
All right. How long you been in the bureaucracy? Can anybody answer this question? Chief, how about you? Is illegal immigration illegal?
Yes, Senator, it is.
Okay, thank you. And that's part of the problem here. Some of my friends in the Congress just think illegal immigration is not illegal. And some apparently think illegal immigration is a moral good. And I don't get it. I just don't. Let's shift, though, from trying to blame it on the president or the law or whatever. Tell me what to do about it with specificity. I listened to all of you. I appreciate it. I understand we have a problem at the border, and my friends at the New York Times even recognize it now. What do we do about it? How do we change the asylum laws?
Senator, if I may, first and foremost, we have to have the ability to hold families throughout the immigration process. Together, throughout the immigration process. And
Okay,
with the
what else?
Forest Settlement Agreement,
Yes,
the fact that we cannot hold them longer than 20 days, it is just not possible to get through the entire immigration system in 20 days.
Okay, so
That's one.
we need the authority to hold families together. What else?
Yes, sir. We need to tighten the asylum process as well to address the low bar for credible fear.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning the standards for credible fear. When you speak of the first,
Excuse me for interrupting, Chief,
Okay.
but, you know, we're limited on time. Does that mean that people who seek asylum lie?
no, Senator. What it means is when they make a credible fear claim, that is a lower standard than ultimately for asylum. So therefore, many of them initially pass a credible fear claim, but then when they reach the asylum, they do not meet that standard. So we need to tighten those two up.
What else?
The other thing that I would say is, as I stated before, eliminate the double standard when it comes to unaccompanied children. And something I didn't state, all unaccompanied children have the ability to claim credible fear as well, and that
What do
will
you mean
always
by
be
the
taken
double
into.
standard, Chief?
If you are from unaccompanied children who are from Mexico or Canada can be returned to Mexico or Canada if they can make can make a decision. There's no fear of returning to their countries. We cannot do that with these other countries.
What else?
Those are the main three that I would tell you.
Anybody else want to suggest? Yes, sir.
Yes, Senator. So you have two problem sets. What Chief Provost is talking about, that would impact the family units and the UAC numbers that we're seeing. Additionally, we still have the border security mission that we have to take care of, and that includes a personnel, technology, and infrastructure in order to enhance our detection and response capabilities.
Okay. What I'm looking for, tell me what we can do to solve this problem. The Chief gave me 3 ideas. Anybody else? You see it every day.
Can I add one more, sir?
Absolutely, Chief. You seem to be the only.
ICE needs bed space to hold single adults. I currently have 7,000, as of this morning, over 7,000 single adults in my custody because ICE does not have sufficient bed space to take them out of my custody. My facilities are meant as temporary holding facilities. ICE needs beds. Them not having beds is impacting us.
I don't want to abuse my privilege. Here's my last question, Mr. Chairman. Is the faucet the same, Chief?
No, sir. The demographic has changed dramatically, which is why we are having these issues.
Has the water flow changed?
It has gone up dramatically, as I stated. We have surpassed already this year total apprehensions all the way back to 2009.
Have we ever had
For every year.
5,000 people a day? A day?
The 5,200 mark, I know at least going back for several years, no.
Do you want to treat these folks in an inhumane manner?
No. My agents are, I am so proud of my men and women for what they are having to deal with.
You know of anybody in any government service dealing with immigration who's treated our world's neighbors who come here in an inhumane manner, intentionally?
No, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me say thank you for everything you all do. I know it's one of the hardest jobs we have, and it's probable that you don't get a lot of compliments, but a lot of criticism. And I just want you to know that at least I understand that as a Californian and very much appreciate what you do. I've been trying to figure out a problem. Let me read something from a CNN article. Excuse me. Customs and Border Protection on Thursday ended its controversial $297 million hiring contract with Accenture, according to 2 senior DHS officials and an Accenture representative. As of December, when you terminated part of the contract, the company had only completed processing 58 applicants, and only 22 had made it onto the payroll for about a year. So there was $297 million to Accenture for hiring, and only 22 actual hires resulted. Could you comment, please?
Ma'am, I apologize, but myself and EAC Owen are lead operations in the field. I think that we probably need to get you a briefing from our staffing that handles the hiring and the human capital. And I would offer that up.
Mr. Owen?
And Senator, I would just like to comment on the current staffing situation along our ports of entry within the Office of Field Operations. Excuse me. We have made tremendous progress in the last several years in terms of recruiting and directing our new hires to the southwest border where we have the greatest need. We brought on 351 new officers last year over attrition. We lose about 700 officers a year through normal attrition. So that would have been hiring of over 1,000 last year. This year, because of the improvements we have made through the hiring process, the recruitment process, we're looking at bringing on over 1,150 new CBP officers for our ports of entry. So the hiring at the ports of entry within the Office of Field Operations is very strong. We have much different challenges than the Border Patrol hiring, where the Accenture contract was mainly geared towards.
Okay, now let me ask another question. If I understand this, ICE maintains approximately 2,500 detention beds for families. But reports indicate that even those beds are empty. ICE is requesting an extra $300 million to increase the number of available detention beds. Source is Washington Post report. White House asked Congress $4.5 billion in emergency spending at border, May 1, 2019. Is that correct or false?
So, ma'am, as it relates to the number of family beds and as to whether they're, the population is they're filled or not, at this time, we do have 3 family residential centers. We have one in Pennsylvania, that's the Berks Family Residential Center. I think it's about 96 beds. Generally, we use that FRC for dual heads of household families, which are few and far between. And we also reserve that FRC in the event that we are in need to detain families, say, that are to the north. Not used as often. Obviously, it would be of great expense and manpower to be moving individuals or family units from the southern border to this specific FRC.
Whoa, but is it correct that ICE maintains 2,500 detention beds for families?
We do. We have 2,500 beds at our
How many
disposal.
are filled right now?
At this time, we are using Carnes, which at one time was just over 800 for families. We have had to convert that facility at this time for single adult females to help with the explosion of single adult females that are coming across. We've transferred.
How many family beds are currently being used for single females?
We have approximately 650 single females are in our family residential center at Carnes. We've had to go to that emergency plan so that we can continue to help our colleagues with the backlog of the single adults at the border.
Thank you for being upfront with me about it.
Sure.
So what is likely to happen to restore the number of family beds, if anything?
So if I may, the last one where we are in fact holding family units is at Dilley. This is our.
I don't know where that is.
That's in the Rio Grande Valley, and so.
Texas country.
In Texas, yes, ma'am. And at this time, we have roughly, I want to say for today's count, approximately 1,900 in custody.
Children?
Families.
Families.
So these are female single heads of household, along with their children, who are housed at this family residential center.
Can you break that down into numbers of children versus single-family heads?
I don't have that specific
Maybe
number
you
as
could
it
get that
relates.
to me, because I'm
Sure.
really interested in
I mean, by and large, you can say one mother may have 1, maybe 2 children. Sometimes we are booking in as many as 3, but we can certainly get that number for you.
Now, if I understand this, ICE is requesting an extra $300 million to increase the number of available detention beds? That's in this budget that we're doing now.
So for the entire, across the continuum for ICE detention beds, we are absolutely in dire need of additional beds, adult beds. You heard the chief saying that she's backed up. I mean, as of today, I think we're in the ranks of 8,000 single adults that are looking for placement
So
into our
that's
beds.
different than the 2,500 detention beds.
There are 2,500 family beds, and then we are funded for just over 42,000 single adult beds. So we have greatly surpassed, at this point, our 42,000 single adult beds. Our average daily population, we're anywhere between 46 and 48,000 single adults in our single adult
Is that
beds.
the big need, adult beds or family beds?
Well, truly, if we could hold families beyond the 20 days, so that we could ensure that they have their day in court and see their cases to fruition, we could absolutely use more beds, given the numbers of family units that are coming over. But again, just to confirm what the chief has shared, this explosion in single adults as well, we are in dire need. If I may share one interesting statistic, this time last year, the end of April last year, we booked into ICE custody 128,000 Cbp apprehensions, okay? The end of April of just a couple of weeks ago, we booked in 242,000 Cbp arrests. That's 114,000 more over last year, that same time frame. We are in a dire need for additional single adult beds. We are constantly working to acquire temporary beds to make sure that the current inventory, individuals that are in our custody right now, are having their cases timely heard, or if they are in need of being timely released, or affecting timely removal, so that we can accommodate the nonstop surge of even single adults coming across.
One other question. It's my understanding there's 200 million in carryover funding. Is it possible to use that 200 million for additional beds?
However we can be, however we can be funded, whatever congressionally we are allowed to do to acquire those beds, we will do. But what's important
Well,
here.
some of us are appropriators.
Yes, ma'am.
Committee, and if you could get us the answer to that question, because the money, we'll take a good look at it and see if it can be used for the purposes where there's need.
Much appreciated. And if I may, I think what we have to think of the full sort of complement of when we are buying that bed. The continuum, it doesn't stop there. So for every additional tranche of beds that I am acquiring, so that I can address Chief's backup there at the border because her stations can't hold, I need the infrastructure to support and ensure that those individuals are getting their cases timely heard, that they are being medically properly cared for, et cetera. And that tends to be the larger problem, where we will fund one part of the continuum, but then it's a lopsided situation because we have all of these additional folks theoretically coming into custody, and then we need the additional components to be able to address that growing population.
Where does HHS come into this problem? Because the jurisdiction is essentially HHS.
Yes, ma'am.
Changed it from ICE to HHS.
Right. So my
We'll turn to Senator Tillis after you answer that question.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So our piece, as it relates to HHS, is we provide transport of the unaccompanied children to HHS. So again, there's a bill that goes to that, the transporting fees. I'm way past, I'm very much in the red, given the surge of the HHS, of the children that are coming across, and they require the placement. So I fund and transport the children to HHS.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here and for the very difficult task. You're doing the very best you can right now. Chief Provost, did I get the number right? Did you say almost 400,000 crossings between, over what period of time?
For the fiscal year through April, Southwest border apprehensions, 460,294.
Okay.
I expect we will surpass 500,000 this weekend.
Okay, so we're reaching a point where the state of, maybe it's Wyoming, I think there are about 600,000 people. That's how many people we have going through the process since the fiscal year began in October of last year. I tell you, one thing that I don't think a lot of people are hearing in the testimony that we received today from you all is you have a crisis. No wonder you're having a problem recruiting border agents now. I mean, if we have a all-volunteer Army and we do a pretty good job of hitting our recruiting targets because they know we're going to provide the resources, the training, and the capabilities that they need to take the fight. Why on earth, with what you hear up in Congress, would anybody line up to do this dangerous job when there's zero consistent support from this Congress to actually equip you all to do your job?
I believe the situation that's going on and the inability for us to have the resources that we need to do it are certainly impacting our recruitment.
And there is one statistic that I have confirmed that's indisputable. It came from the Department of Justice. We fact-checked it twice. 80%, Mr. Padilla used a slightly higher number, but 80% of the people who are coming across the border, now a population since October of last year, almost equal to our least populous state, ultimately get adjudicated that they don't have a legitimate asylum claim. You know what they do have? In this country, if you exposed your child, what some of these parents and adults are doing to that child, you'd be in a court of law for endangering a child. And yet we're allowing, you're collecting bodies every month of people who were lied to. Money was taken away from them. Children are being raped. And we don't recognize that as a flow or a faucet that we should shut off? I mean, honestly, I don't believe any of you here are asking for resources you don't need. So I'm not going to get into a technical discussion of the number of beds or what state of processing you're in. I mean, have any of you knowingly requested resources that you don't need? And do you believe that those resources are really sufficient given the current flow? Or are they just bailing out a sinking ship? So none of you have fudged the numbers, asking for more than you need and just throwing money around, right? So this is a critical situation where this baseline funding is absolutely essential to secure communities and actually provide a safer environment for people who cross the border illegally. Do you all agree with that?
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Owen, when we divert customs agents from trying to just make sure that the legal commerce, the legal passings are, we're interdicting all the drugs, illicit materials that may be in there. When we divert them to other tasks, what happens? We get more drugs coming into the country through the legal channels?
I believe so. I look at the situation we face.
Do we smuggle more women and children into human slavery?
I believe so.
Yeah. Chief Provost, what is the general morale of the people that go? I've been out there, Senator Cornyn had some of us go out there. I've been on horseback, low draft boats, ATVs, spent better part of a week out there, and I saw some brave men and women doing the job. But do they feel like Congress has its back right now?
You know, Senator, I said before, I'm so impressed with my men and women and what they do day in and day out, and what they have to deal with. And I will tell you, it is certainly negatively impacting morale.
Well, God bless them. And honestly, it was said about how the influx in crossings over the last year, but I think, Mr. Owen, it may have been you, actually it may have been Ms. Asher that was talking about Flores in 2015. When people in other countries being educated by the cartels and the plaza managers said, hey, we can get you here and it's going to be a ticket into this country, that's when we started seeing the influx. And the president, the reason that there, I think, was a cessation at one point when President Trump came in is because he was serious about securing the border, using people, technology, and infrastructure to do it. But when it became apparent that we can't get a bipartisan agreement, that we have future flows that are unsustainable and people are dying, children, women are dying, making this illegal crossing, it's not the president's fault. It's people exploiting Flores, it's people exploiting our legal process for financial gain among the organized crime, and it's just disgusting to think that we can't recognize that it's in the best interest of the 80% of the people who are going to come here be adjudicated, not having a legitimate asylum claim, Please don't do that to your children. Don't let that 3-year-old be found in a cornfield. Don't put our border security agents at risk. Recognize this is a problem. We can debate a lot of the other issues, but this is a national crisis. It's a national emergency, and we have to get Congress to act, or it's only going to get worse. Your story a year from now is going to make today's testimony look like good news. Thank you all for what you do, and I'll do anything I can to help you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Hirano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my questions, I'd like to note an issue involving citizens of the freely associated states of Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands, which are critical national security partners to the United States. It appears that based on new DHS guidelines, these citizens are being denied access to Real ID Act compliant driver's licenses and ID cards. And this is in spite of the fact that Congress unanimously passed a law last year to enable these citizens to obtain permanent IDs under the Real ID Act. And since your colleagues from ISIS, USCIS, and DHS's policy office are not here today, I just wanted to mention this to you all because there are thousands and thousands of COFA citizens who are being negatively impacted by this change to DHS's guidelines about how driver's licenses can be obtained. Ms. Asher, I'm looking at your testimony, page 3 of your testimony, in which you note that the ATD, the Alternative to Detention Programs, does not further ICE's statutory mission of removing those who are illegally present in the United States and have been ordered removed by an immigration judge. I'd like you to clarify for me who constitutes the illegally present population in our country. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the term illegally present includes visa overstayers, those without documentations, those who came across between ports of entry. Are those the largest categories of those that you deem illegally present in our country?
So I'm not quite sure I follow the question, ma'am. Individuals who are here unlawfully, or if they are out of status, are considered in any illegal status as it relates to immigration law. I'm not quite sure I follow the question. My apologies.
I'm getting to the priorities that you have to establish for deportations. Okay. So visa overstayers are not legally present in our country. So would that fit under your term illegally present persons?
So I'm not, I believe that some are. I can.
Yes, there's two categories of visa overstays. There's in-country overstays and out-of-country overstays. Everyone comes in for a duration of status. There's a time they're supposed to leave. Some don't leave on time, but leave later, and we know they have left the country. Those are out-of-country overstays. Some have never left. Those are in-country overstays.
We have a lot of in-country overstayers. We know that. Yeah. So some, I've heard that even as much as 40% of the 11 million or so who are undocumented in our country are visa overstayers. So these would all be, I'm getting to the groups, so there are large groups of people who could be deemed illegally present and subject to deportation. And actually, I would say visa overstayers are among those, and those who are without documentation. That would include the visa overstayers, but there are about 11 million people in our country without documentation who would be subject to deportation. So correct me if I'm wrong on that, Ms. Asher.
I don't have the breakdown here today as it relates to what constitutes the number of the 11 million at this point.
Well, no, I'm just so what I'm getting at, as I mentioned before, is that with so many people who would fit into your illegally present group, ICE has to have a prioritizing on deportation. So do you have a priority as to who would be deported?
So what we do is we enforce the removal orders as we receive them in conjunction with working with the immigration courts.
No, but who are the groups that are subject to deportation proceedings?
So if individuals who are subject to deportation proceedings, So anyone here who has broken our immigration laws or who has perhaps overstayed their time here are subject
So
to
that's a
removal
lot of
proceedings.
people.
It
And
is a
when you
lot of
have when you have a category with 11 million people that could be deported, you have to have some priorities. So I'm asking, what are your priorities
So
for deportation? And if you'd like to get back to me with that, you can, because you have to have priorities.
Well, we
You can't be
absolutely
deporting
do.
11 million people.
well, no, that simply the problem is far larger than resources collectively, the courts, my deportation
Yes,
officers.
and
However,
I'm running out of time, and this is why you have to have priorities. And I just would like to know what those priorities are, and if those priorities can be disclosed to our committee, that would be helpful. Could you go back and Mr. Chairman, I think I'm asking a pretty simple question, because they can't possibly be deporting 11 million people, so they have to have certain priorities, and I would really like to know what those priorities are.
so
Let
if
me-
I,
I think
Let
the
me move
senator's-
on.
I think the senator's right, so if you could please
Sure.
supply us with with ICE's priorities and the U.S. government's priorities in terms of
So
deportation.
certainly-
My understanding is it's people who commit criminal offenses.
Right. I mean, I was
Serious
just-
felonies and the like would be the first to go.
Understood. So, and that is in sort of the public safety realm. Obviously, individuals who have been convicted.
Yes, so I understand that, and so if you do
Okay.
have such a list, I would like to have them, because I think we all know that there have been people who have been deported, who have basically committed what I would call very low level kind of felonies, so I'd just like to know where these people fall. May I ask just one more question, since I have to go through so much explanation on my first question? Acting Homeland Security Secretary Kevin McAleenan has previously acknowledged that it is absolutely essential to address root causes of migration in Northern Triangle countries. So that would mean, though, that we need to provide foreign aid to these countries so that we can get to the root causes of the violence in these countries that cause so many of their people to attempt to create a better life for themselves in our country. So do you agree do the panelists agree that we do need to get to the root causes in some way, which would be foreign aid? Chief Provost?
Senator, if I may, there are numerous push and pull
Yes,
factors.
I understand.
And that is a push factor, but I will tell you that the majority of the individuals that we are apprehending that we do interviews with are economic migrants, that because they are in a state of economic distress versus the violence being the main factor.
Yeah, I would say that, so that goes to whether or not their asylum claim would be upheld.
So
Mr. Owen?
we'll go to
Can
Senator
we
Lee.
just, do you mind if they just go down the list as to whether the root causes is something that we need to address?
No, I think the
Mr. Owen?
chief hit it well.
Just very briefly, the chairman would like to go to another question or so. Yes or no, do we need to address the root
No,
causes?
I think we need to address the root causes, yes.
Ms. Asher,
root causes is certainly one of the main, yes.
thank you.
Senator, HHS is committed to the health and well-being of the children that are referred to us. We do not set or enforce immigration.
Mr. Padilla?
I believe Central America has to be provided aid, but it has to be targeted aid. It has to have accountability.
Yes, I understand. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chief. I'd note that the United States track record when it comes to nation building is not all that great. Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks for what you do for a living and for what you do to keep us safe. The situation at the border has become a crisis on many levels. Certainly a humanitarian crisis, absolutely a crisis for the rule of law. This is sort of what happens when a legal regime itself contains loopholes within it that can be manipulated in such a way as to undermine the very interests, the very objectives sought to be achieved through that system of laws. And that's what has happened here. We've had a systemic breakdown at the border with many of its root causes within our legal system itself. And it's causing serious problems that that result in gut-wrenching consequences. Just from a human standpoint, it's tragic. One of the most gut-wrenching of these consequences involves the trafficking and smuggling of minors. Just a few weeks ago, we heard testimony from a hero, a gentleman named Tim Ballard, runs a group called Operation Underground Railroad, and he told us about some of the horrible conditions in which people are subjected, children are subjected as they're trafficked across the border. And he explained to us, our own laws are perpetuating this sort of thing. They're fueling the wide-scale profiteering, the wide-scale profiting by drug cartels in human trafficking, in the human trafficking of children. Now, in some cases, traffickers send unaccompanied minor aliens across the border with the full expectation, the full understanding, in fact, the objective that the child will be apprehended. The traffickers know that under Flores, the child must be released quickly, in many cases, to a sponsor claiming to be a relative. And so as a result, the traffickers' accomplices on the American side of the border can come to the shelters, our shelters operated by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and attempt to claim the child. And so I'd like to start with you, Mr. Hayes. Is ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, is it thoroughly vetting all sponsors?
Absolutely, sir, without a doubt.
Now, with the sheer volume we are dealing with, and as I understand it, in the 6 months ending, I believe, in March of this year, you processed 32,284 children in just 6 months.
Yes,
Is that about right?
That sounds about right, yes, sir.
And when you're processing that many children, over 32,000 in that 6-month period, and holding them only for a short period of time, is it even possible to do the vetting necessary in order to protect children from traffickers?
Yes, sir, it is.
So you can know with confidence in every one of those circumstances that the person showing up is who that person claims to be, and that that person is not involved in the illicit trafficking of children?
Yes, sir. I have the utmost confidence in our staff and our grantees as they work through the sponsorship process to identify sponsors, work through the sponsorship reunification package, robust background checks, public records checks, sex offender registry background checks, and for anyone currently other than the moms and the dads, also we do FBI background checks. So I have full confidence in my team and our grantees and the work that they do, because every single employee and grantee of the Office of Refugee Resettlement wants to see the children released first, as safely as possible,
Sure.
number two, as quickly as possible.
No, sure, and I don't doubt for an instant that that is your objective and that of those you work with. I would suggest here that it may not be entirely possible to protect everyone from the risk that they could be manipulating those standards. Now, to be clear, I want to make perfectly clear that I don't blame Border Patrol or ORR for the problems that we face or the risks that we confront. I think you're facing a perfect storm of sorts in terms of the humanitarian crisis we're dealing with. I primarily blame us, Congress, that is. We know that our immigration laws are ripe for abuse. We know, in fact, that they are being abused. We know that there are children in the thousands in the last year alone who have, in fact, been trafficked through the system, abusing this very same set of laws. And at a minimum, we know that changes to Flores are necessary and changes to the TVPRA. Chief Provost, Border Patrol officers will start conducting credible fear interviews later this year. Is that right?
We are working with our partners at USCIS on a pilot program. At this point, we are working through the training process on that.
And the hope and the expectation there is that that change may well help to weed out what might be frivolous claims or manipulative claims that are not warranted?
Yes, sir.
But the standard they'll be using, as I understand it, is the same one used by USCIS asylum officers. Is that right?
The training is from USCIS, and it has to meet their standards. We're working hand in hand as we attempt to move forward on a pilot program.
Right. Do we, in your opinion, need changes to the credible fear standard in order to reduce the discrepancy between findings of credible fear and actual grants of asylum?
That is certainly one of the things that we need to do. We need to bring the credible fear standards up to the same standards as asylum.
And, Mr. Chairman, if I can ask just one more question, what would those changes look like?
When anybody can claim credible fear when they come in to the country, and that's just basically, do they have a fear of returning to their country? But the asylum laws are more stringent when it comes to what meets asylum, for instance. They may have a fear to go back to their country because of economic reasons and the situation they're in. That would be one example that is not going to meet asylum regulations.
Thank you. I see my time's expired.
Thank you, Senator
Mr. Chairman.
Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Provost, good to see you again. And I'm, like some others on this committee, I wear two hats on appropriations as Vice Chairman of Appropriations and as member of this committee. We have to figure out just how the money is going to be used and what it's going to be used for, which requires transparency from you, all of you, with the American people. Now, on June 23rd, 2018, 3 days after President Trump was pressured to officially rescind what I feel was an inhumane family separation policy, DHS released a fact sheet to the public stating it had a process established in place to ensure that parents are reunited with their children. Ms. Asher, was this DHS fact sheet inaccurate or misleading in any way at the time it was released on June 23rd, 2018?
Thank you. Excuse me.
So I mean, repeat the question.
No, I'm making sure that I'm referring to the correct document here. So what we were doing,
No, just answer the question simply. You released a fact sheet to the public stating you had a process established in place to ensure that parents are reunited with their children. Was that fact sheet accurate or in any way misleading? That's a fact sheet DHS issued.
the fact sheet is if we had a shared way, a SharePoint system that we call, that we tried to meld the various systems together that were not originally
Thank you.
designed to talk to one another
Was it
as a
inaccurate or
database.
misleading in any way? That's a simple question. You have
I
to
don't
know.
think that it's misleading. I just think
Okay.
that it requires further explanation.
And the
as
reason
to-
I asked that, on the exact same day, you had emails between HHS and ICE officials saying that we do not have linkage from parents to their children, and the government had no way to link parents to children. So on the same day, you have a fact sheet that says it was not misleading, but appears from the emails to be misleading.
So I think in a very systematic explanation of true databases talking to one another, there was no automatic link because HHS is not a law enforcement agency. DHS is. The siloed systems obviously were not designed to talk to one another originally. However, through this process, we did create, through various spreadsheets and crossover of information, a SharePoint, which is a database-like system that we used as a group in our successful effort in reuniting the parents with the children.
Okay, I'll put it into the record because you are on that email chain, and so I will submit and put in the record it because, frankly, I understand the, I understand the bureaucraty's way you say it, and I don't mean that as a slam everybody does, but it's contradictory. Reports indicate that President Trump recently pressed administration officials to resurrect a new version of family separation. Are you aware of plans to resurrect any policy, including so-called binary choice, that have the effect, even if not the primary intent, separating children from their parents? That should be an easy yes or no.
I am not aware, no.
Anybody else? Okay, let the record show everybody said no. Almost all migrants released from custody are family units, women and children. The statistics show the vast majority of them are going to show up in court. The president has said that the so-called catch and release of migrants results in violent criminals flooding our streets. Mr. Padilla and Ms. Asher, does DHS or ICE have statistics indicating what percentage of migrants released from DHS custody are later convicted of serious violent crimes?
I don't have those statistics with me here today. However, if I may take the opportunity to further correct.
Are they available?
We can certainly get those.
Will you submit that for the record?
We will submit that,
Can you
yes.
do it within a week?
We can do it within the week.
Please do. Thank you. Go ahead.
What I wanted to clarify for you, Senator, is as it relates, I think there's a misperception regarding those family units who are showing up for court. We did a recent joint pilot with DOJ calling an expedited family unit docket that we started it in September, and through April, individuals who were last in have been first up in 10 cities to appear before immigration judges to have their asylum cases heard. In fact, we've had an 87% no-show rate for those families to appear before the immigration judges. So I think there's a disconnect in understanding that, in fact, the family units are not appearing in great numbers before the immigration judges for their asylum cases to be heard, which then leaves a further burden for my resources to go back and frankly find these individuals, because now they are final orders of removal. So that particular population, as we continue to release into the interior hundreds, if not thousands, of family units into the interior every week, is of grave concern as it relates to these individuals not appearing before immigration judges and now being fugitives.
Yeah, and if they are involved in violent or serious crimes, that's going to show up in our statistics, will it not?
We'll get you those numbers that are separate and apart from actually answering the question regarding family units that are appearing before the court.
No, but I asked about what the president said when he catch and release, as he calls it. They flood our streets with violent criminals, and certainly in my state, which is a very safe state, we're wondering about that. We've had Border Patrol come down into communities and set up roadblocks and all quite a distance from the border. They don't catch anybody, but I'm worried if you're short-handed and all, how that goes on, why they have enough people to do it. I'm just curious. I was impressed, as I told the chief provost, with the people I met when I spent a couple days down the border. My time is up, so I will.
Thank you, Senator. On behalf of the chair, thank you. And I'm not going to, though I'm holding the gavel, ask a few questions myself. Chief Provost, let me just direct my questions to you to start with. The enterprise on the southern border, somebody's profiting from what's going on the southern border, right? I mean, who is it? Who's profiting from what's going on down south?
Smugglers are profiting. They don't care what they bring across the border as long as they get money.
And who else? Who controls the southern border on the Mexico side?
There are various cartels that control the plazas.
And does anybody cross that border illegally without the permission of the cartels?
That is generally not the case.
Do the cartels profit on those who cross the border with their help and permission?
I would say yes, sir.
So the cartels are profiting from the use of children, for instance, who are being used as human shields to get across the border. Is that accurate?
They are profiting from the children, the family units, yes.
All of it. So we basically have a situation where on the southern side, we have drug cartels that are in charge of the border, controlling the border, profiting from every footfall that goes across that border, and creating this crisis, the present humanitarian crisis in this country. Is that fair to say?
Well, they are certainly utilizing the humanitarian crisis to divert our resources so that they can also smuggle other contraband across.
Increasing their profit margins.
Yes, sir.
So let me just ask you, speaking of other contraband, sometimes we hear the argument that states like mine, the state of Missouri in the middle of the country, doesn't really have any stake of the game when it comes to what's going on along the border. But in fact, large quantities of drugs are smuggled across the border. Isn't that right? Am I right in thinking that?
That is correct. In fact, just yesterday, Border Patrol, in conjunction with some other law enforcement partners, had a seizure of 1,000 pounds of methamphetamine.
1,000 pounds of methamphetamine. Just a few months ago in Missouri, the leader of a major meth smuggling operation based in Mexico was sentenced to 38 years in prison for distributing over $1 million worth of meth throughout my state, throughout the state of Missouri. And not even 2 weeks ago, DEA agents in Texas stopped a Greyhound bus bound for Kansas City, Missouri, that had $1.8 million worth of methamphetamine aboard. It's probably for this reason that your predecessor, who's now President Trump's nominee to head ICE, I'm thinking of Mark Morgan, made a point that I think is absolutely critical. He said that every city in America is a border city, and every state in America is a border state. Would you agree with that, Chief?
Border security is national security. This impacts the entire nation.
Let me ask you about, actually, Ms. Asher, let me ask you about asylum processing in Mexico. I want to talk to you about the administration's migration protection protocols. What's important about this policy is that it's helping to remove the incentive for unaccompanied children and families to attempt to cross the United States and claim asylum frivolously, as I understand it, so that they can be paroled in the United States. I know it's been only a few months since the policy was announced, but can you tell me, has there been any progress made on that policy? What effects are you seeing?
So I will have to defer to CBP, as that is a port court jurisdiction.
Yes, sir. We started the migration protection protocols about early February or so. So since that time, we've returned 4,000 individuals, family units back into Mexico to wait for their court hearing to occur later in the docket. So the program is gearing up. We're currently operational in San Ysidro, in Calexico, and in El Paso. And again, we are seeing those returns going back into Mexico, waiting for their court date, returning to the port as scheduled, then returning up to the court and continuing out with their process.
Can you give me a sense of what help or...
We're going to need to turn to Senator Blumenthal after this question.
Can you give me a sense of what help or resistance you've seen from the Mexican government in assisting with this policy?
The Mexican government has been a very good partner with us. They have to agree to take the individuals back, so we work with them daily on the logistics as to how many they could receive, the shelters that are available, things of that nature. We've agreed upon the amenable populations that we are returning to them, so they've been a good partner with us on this program.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Padilla, let me just ask one clarifying question. I think we've assumed everybody understands why detention capacity is important. We've just assumed that people understand that, and I'm not sure that's the case. I remember back during the Bush administration, George W. Bush, Secretary Chertoff, we had an influx of Brazilians coming across the border, and wondered why that was. And I remember Secretary Chertoff saying the only reason that stopped is because we began detaining and not catching and releasing those individuals. Can you just sort of simply tell us again, why is detention capacity important in terms of controlling the pull factor that is attracting people here and deterring this illegal migration?
Yes, Senator. It goes back to what Chief Provost was talking about, having a consequence. A consequence does not have to be a criminal consequence. It doesn't necessarily have to be a prosecution, but detaining a person so they can have a fair process, immigration process, and at the end of that process, be returned to their country. Every time we have done that, throughout the history of the Border Patrol, we have reduced the population of said the population that is becoming problematic as far as numbers. Very specifically to the family units that we're talking about today, in 2014, 2015, the previous administration was holding family units until they went through their immigration process and returning them at the end of the process, and we saw a decline of this population that we're now facing.
Thank you for that explanation. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. As you know, the Secretary of Defense recently issued waivers that expand military activities at the border. In fact, those waivers enable military personnel to interact with migrants to support a Department of Homeland Security request for assistance. I have written today to the Secretary of Defense, in effect saying these waivers are very questionable in legality. I happen to believe they are a violation of law. I've asked for the legal justification. That letter has been joined by 18 or more of my colleagues, some members of the Armed Services Committee and some not. Anybody on this panel involved in that request to the Department of Defense for expanded military activities? Chief?
I'm not certain of that exact request. I can tell you that we have done requests for assistance that involve Department of Defense helping take on some of the non-law enforcement duties so that my men and women can get back to the border.
Not those waivers?
I don't know about the waivers.
Okay, thank you. Chief, you started serving as Deputy Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol in 2016, I think.
That is correct.
That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
On May 7th, 2018, 1 year ago today, Attorney General Jeff Sessions publicly disclosed this administration's policy of family separation. Through the summer of 2018, this administration separated nearly 3,000 parents and children. Millions of Americans were outraged by this abhorrent policy. I was one of them. Other members of this committee spoke out as well. And a federal court ordered the administration to reunify all the separated families. In January of this year, as you know, the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services released a report that revealed family separation was far worse than initially known. The Inspector General found that this administration had been separating thousands of families starting as early as the summer of 2017, a full year earlier than we initially knew. When did you become aware that this administration was separating thousands of children from their families?
Senator, first and foremost, through zero tolerance, we were addressing a zero tolerance prosecution.
I'm just
initiative.
asking, because my time is limited, if you would please, when did you become
I will
aware?
tell you that throughout my career, we have had cases where we have separated families, and we are still separating
Well, let me
families
ask
in
you,
the welfare
I
of the child
apologize,
today.
I want to ask it in a more precise way. You're absolutely right to point out the lack of precision in my question. For reasons other than fraud or the safety of the child, when did you first become aware that the administration had embarked on a policy of family separation other than for fraud or safety of children?
Once again, I would tell you there is no family, has not been a family separation policy. There has been a prosecution policy, and we have separated for prosecution in the past as well, family members.
Well, I find that answer, with all due respect, disappointing because you know that there has been a family separation policy. Let me ask you, Mr. Hayes, because in your testimony today, you state it will take 6 months just to identify the children separated from their parents between the summer of 2017 and the summer of 2018. How long will it take to reunify all the families separated between the summer of 2017 and the summer of 2018 if it takes 6 months to identify them?
Sir, that would be a question, Senator Blumenthal, that I would be happy to get back to you on. I do know that...
Why would you not know today as you sit here?
Because that particular operation, as agreed to with the judge, is under the direction of Commander Jonathan White with the Public Health Service at HHS, with the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, working with the staff at ORR and the staff at AS.
How long will it take you to get back to us with an answer?
I'd have to go back and check with our team and circle back with your staff as soon as possible, sir.
Could you give us a date by which you will know the answer, say by the end of the week?
I would not presume to provide a date, sir.
Well,
I will promise you this.
you know,
we'll get
since
back
we're
to you as
talking
quick as
about
possible.
time here, with all due respect again, Mr. Hayes, some of these separated children were very young, maybe even toddlers. They have been separated from their parents, some of them for more than half their lives. And I would ask you, have you asked for additional resources to undertake this task?
Yes, sir, we have.
And what has been the response?
The response from who, sir?
It's what?
The response from who?
Who did you request additional resources from?
We've asked for additional resources from Congress to continue to operate the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and in order to.
What about your budget?
Yeah, that's the budget. We've asked for an additional $2.9 billion to continue to operate the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the children that are in our care now. And continue
Let me again be more precise with you. Have you asked the Department of Homeland Security for immediate funding, apart from the budget request to Congress, in order to accomplish the task of reunifying these perhaps thousands of families?
Yeah. I am not aware specifically of any asks for resources from them.
You're not aware of
Happy
any
to get those
requests
back
for
to you just
additional
as soon as possible, Senator.
You'll get back to me as soon as
Just
possible?
as soon as we possibly can, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hayes, do you know of any entity within the federal government that can appropriate money other than Congress?
No, sir, Senator, I'm not.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of you for being here. It's good to see you again. Let me say a special thanks to the men and women of Border Patrol, the men and women of ICE for doing an exceptionally difficult and exceptionally important job at a time that is particularly challenging. And we are grateful for the men and women of law enforcement and the work you do every day to keep us safe. Chief Provost, can you give us the most up-to-date statistics on how many people are crossing the border illegally and what the trend has been that you've been seeing?
Certainly, Senator. Overall, fiscal year to date, 460,294. That's Border Patrol Southwest border apprehensions. Just in the month of April, for Border Patrol Southwest border, 98,977. And the trend, it is increasing day by day. We had a group just last week of over 50, or a day where we apprehended over 5,200 people. We are seeing groups in this, we've actually apprehended 148 large groups of individuals. Compare that to 13 last fiscal year and 2 the fiscal year before that. And when I say a large group, that's 100 or more people in one group, 148 of those groups. As you know well, the demographic is changing as well. We have apprehended over 165,000 individuals from Guatemala, 133,000 from Honduras, 42,000 from El Salvador. Currently, 80% of our apprehensions are other than Mexican nationals, which is a huge demographic shift from where we were just a few years ago. 74% are from the Northern Triangle. And in FY18, we apprehended individuals from over 140 different countries. And this fiscal year to date, we've already apprehended individuals from 127 different countries.
In your judgment, to what extent does catch and release contribute to this massive increase in illegal crossings?
It is a huge pull factor. In my opening statement, I said my biggest concern is that we will have to start releasing single adults if ICE cannot get enough bed space. What we have seen with family units, since we have had to release all family units, we have seen the numbers grow exponentially. I am highly concerned about what's happening with single adults. Those numbers are increasing dramatically. Over 167,000 single adults. Everybody's focused on the humanitarian crisis. We have a crisis here as well. those individuals we have to maintain the ability to detain those individuals through their immigration hearings. And we need a way to safely and securely detain families together through the process as well.
In March, Commissioner McAleenan testified before this committee that Border Patrol had identified over 1,700 cases where children crossed the border with adults claiming to be a family unit, only for the Border Patrol to discover that the child and the adult were not related. Can you provide any update on those numbers?
Our fraud numbers are over 3,500 now, year to date, fiscal year to date. That includes individuals who are not related whatsoever. It also may include individuals who claim to be juveniles, but then we determine that they are actually adults themselves, as well as some that
you
may
have the breakdown of how many are fraudulent family units? And if not, if you could get the...
3,500, over 3,500 so far.
So I've heard reports that the cartels are now engaged in the practice of renting children. To what extent has Border Patrol seen that occurring, and is it increasing?
We have seen cases happen. HSI is focused on this as well now and have task forces that are working with us. Just last week, actually an Office of Field Operations officer who was assisting Border Patrol agents identified a case just like that and worked hand in hand with HSI on that investigation where the child admitted to being basically sold by his mother.
Any other witnesses care to elaborate on
Yes,
this
Senator, if I
horrific
may.
practice?
My colleagues in HSI, to reiterate what the chief was talking about, as far as they are moving some of their resources to additional resources to the border, that being victims awareness specialists, special agents, and I think it was around April 15th up through May 3rd. In their conducting their interviews of families, they identified roughly 3 out of every 10 families to not be families. In other words, fraud being conducted. Also,
and let me ask you briefly, just because time is expiring, would you agree that congressional loopholes that make essentially a child a get-out-of-jail-free card
no question.
Incentivize cartels abusing children and putting them in these circumstances?
Absolutely. It's alarming what we are, as we are turning resources to this problem, because first and foremost, the welfare of the children is the most important to all of us for our components. And to the chief's words, I'm really concerned once we start digging into this as to the level of exploitation, these children being recycled, fraudulent documents. Another problem, if I may, adults posing as children. We've had cases where individuals are saying they're 17, 16, we're putting them in HHS care, only to find out after further investigation they're as old as in their late 20s. I mean, the fraud, the exploitation is rampant, and it's not stopping.
Please keep this committee advised as those data and that evidence is developed, because I think this is an issue of particular concern to this committee.
Thank you.
Chief Provost, as the Border Patrols had to deploy more and more agents to deal with the families and children, have you had to pull Border Patrol agents from some of the interior checkpoints?
Yes, Senator, we've had to close down checkpoints. We have actually pulled some agents from task forces with other law enforcement that are critical task forces when it comes to sharing information and working together. Stop training. It has certainly had an impact a negative impact on our border security mission.
Mr. Padilla, when you were chief of the Rio Grande Valley sector of the Border Patrol, I remember visiting the Falfurrias checkpoint in Brooks County. Senator Cruz, I know, has had the same experience I have. One of the starkest memories I have of that is that in the ranches around the Falfurrias checkpoint, where the coyotes leave the migrant to circumvent the checkpoint so that they don't get caught in their vehicle as they transport them into the interior, that the local officials find a number of dead bodies. And in fact, the Brooks County officials have asked us to somehow find a way to reimburse them for taking care of the remains and burying these bodies. What I really wanted to ask about was the other countries that are exploiting this vulnerability in our border. I assume that if people can get here from Central America, they can get here from anywhere in the world. And I do remember down again around the Falfurrias area seeing some of the rescue beacons in Spanish, English, and I believe in Chinese. So do you actually have Chinese individuals coming across the southwestern border into the United States?
Absolutely, Senator. Chief Provost just mentioned that 140 so far, different nationalities. Chinese is definitely one of them. So Sheriff Benny Martinez, right there in Falfurrias, one of the things that stands out to me is the number of deaths that we see every year, between 200 and 300 deaths a year because of a broken border security system. Are huge numbers, and every time or all the time that we spend not taking action on closing that system is really resulting in many unnecessary deaths, in my opinion. So,
140 different countries, Chief Provost?
140 different countries last year, 127 to date this fiscal year. And if I may, just as one example, Senator, when you talk about the checkpoints being closed down, thank God yesterday our Laredo checkpoint was up because they found individuals being smuggled in a box truck through the checkpoint. We were able to apprehend them, but it was 112 degrees inside the back of that box truck where 21 migrants were, to include 2 juveniles. If that checkpoint wasn't there, we can only imagine what could have happened. It could have been a tragedy.
And do some of these 140 different countries where these migrants hail from, are some of these countries that are of particular concern to U.S. national security?
Most certainly, Senator.
And can you give us a few examples?
Yemen, all across. I recently, I think that has been an area, but we are getting people from China, from Brazil, again, Venezuela, many Middle Eastern countries, many countries in Asia, everywhere.
Senator Durbin, any other questions?
Chief Provost, you talked about 3,500 fraudulent families. Over what period of time?
Fiscal year to date, sir.
So the statistics I have suggest that there have been 189,000 family units processed year to date. And you have identified 3,500 fraudulent families. I'm doing rough calculation. That's less than 2%, correct?
I don't do math well in public, but that's a small percentage, yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. So any one of them is of concern. But when we talk about fraudulent, impact on the system, it's lower than 2% of those who are claiming to be families who actually are.
That's the amount that we have been able to identify, Senator. I know that number is higher than that.
I'm sure it could be. And when it comes to the use of Z portals, Mr. Owen?
Yes, sir.
Is it proper to call you Mr. Owen? You look like you've
Mr.
got
Owen.
a rank here.
Mr. Owen's fine, sir.
Okay, fine. So are you familiar with Z portals?
Yes, I am.
You're familiar with the fact that we added hundreds of millions of dollars
Yes, sir.
to your appropriation?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to, at the risk of bragging, say I brought this up to the president. He said, do it.
Yes.
And it was based on Mr. McAleenan's recommendation
Yes.
to me, so it wasn't an original thought.
Yeah.
When I went through the El Paso port of entry, the Z portal wasn't working.
Okay.
So when we're talking about detecting people in 115-degree trailers or narcotics, how often does this technology that's supposed to scan and x-ray all the vehicles coming through break down, do you know?
Well, the technology is very reliable. Obviously, mechanics and things happen, but the more equipment that we have posted at the ports of entry because of the congressional funding allows us to scan higher and higher percentages of the vehicles coming through. Remember, 77 million cars came through last year, the border, so the volumes are just astronomical, and without the advanced non-intrusive inspection equipment that Congress continues to support us with, we would not be able to search any of near those.
Well, there was no partisanship in this. Both parties jumped on it. The president did too.
Yes.
Once we convinced his acting chief of staff. So let me ask this question, Mr. Hayes. When ORR has an unaccompanied child, UAC, and is trying to establish whether or not they should move forward in the process of asylum, how thorough is that process to determine whether that child is eligible or could be eligible for asylum status?
So, sir, that work would be done through the, through the many legal services, provisions that we provide for those UAC. We work with the Executive Office of Immigration Review. You're probably very familiar with VERA, one of our legal services providers, and their subgrantees. We work through that process with each of the children in our care. They're all eligible for legal services. From the Know Your Rights presentation from when they once arrived to determining if there is any potential legal relief for them from an immigration perspective. We work through that. I don't have any specific numbers as to how many seek asylum. I'd be happy to get back to you with that.
I'm not asking for that. That would be too much to ask. What I'm trying to do is to get a grip on what ORR does to determine whether this child may be eligible for asylee status. And you've talked about some legal involvement here. Does the process take more than a few minutes?
Yes, sir. To the best of my knowledge, it does take a little bit more than a few minutes. It's a pretty involved process.
Mm-hmm. And does it involve more than one person making this decision?
Yes, sir. To the best of my knowledge, there is a group of folks that are involved in that decision between the legal services providers, the Executive Office of Immigration Review, an immigration judge, and folks like that that are involved in the process.
So under the current status situation of the law, unaccompanied children from Mexico do not make it to ORR.
That's not entirely true. A very small number might, maybe less than 1 or 2%. If they're further in the interior of the United States, or if they do have a credible fear, Senator, if there is expectation they might have been trafficked, we do get a very small percentage of Mexican children in our care.
Under the ordinary course, this is going to be a decision made by someone other than ORR when it comes to children from Mexico, correct?
That is correct, sir. I would yield to my colleagues at DHS.
And that would be Customs and Border Protection, would it not?
CIS, ultimately.
Okay. So here's the point I'm getting to. When the GAO did a survey or investigated the activities of your agency, Homeland Security Agency, when it came to determining the eligibility of children from Mexico to go forward in the process, they found, and this goes back to 2015, the most recent, they found that there were varying levels of awareness about how they were to assess screening criteria. I understand one of the proposals before us now is that we would shift all of these determinations to Customs and Border Protection, or CIS, away from ORR. The point I'm getting to, I hope, after this long journey, is ORR clearly takes time, brings in people, has legal representation involved in it. It isn't a quick judgment made at the border with a child. So what assurance can you give us that changing this process now and saying all children are going to go through this border decision, they're not going to go to ORR, would result in a fair outcome and justice?
Senator, I can say, speaking to the GAO report, first and foremost, we have put other factors into consideration. When it comes to training, we've revised Form 93 for TVPRA for trafficking screening, and reinforced annual training with our men and women. But as we said earlier, with children in particular, They are of our utmost concern.
Well, let me-
And
can I-
ensuring
can I
that
be
they have the
specific?
right representation, and CIS, that is part of the process. I can't speak fully to the CIS process.
But let me be specific, because what they found was pretty egregious. They said that CBP policy states that the unaccompanied children under the age of 14 are presumed generally unable to make an independent decision. But GAO's analysis of CBP data and a random sample of cases from fiscal year 2014 found that the Border Patrol repatriated 93% of Mexican children under the age of 14 without documenting the basis for their decision. So there was a clear break date in age where they said, you can't do this. You can't presume that these children are not eligible. Are you telling me, what I'm trying to get to is this, we're going to be asked to change the laws, okay, change the faucet. And one of the changes is to make sure that Mr. Hayes in his process doesn't make the decision, but you get to make it. Not you personally, obviously, but closer to the border. And the obvious question that we should ask is, how good are you at this? Because what's at stake here may be the life of a child. So what can you tell me?
Well, as CIS is not represented here, I don't want to get into completely what they do, but I can tell you that we work with the consular officers from the countries of any of these children that we come in contact with, and immigration officials as well when it comes to any returns.
Okay. Well, naturally, there's a concern about returning them to countries that can't protect them or making a decision at the border that doesn't reflect the reality of why they're there. And I think that's one of the things I hope we can work out.
Senator Kennedy.
I'm going to really try to be brief. Tell me again, Ms. Asher, what percentage of our neighbors who are coming here illegally, who claim asylum, are ultimately found to be eligible under the asylum laws?
Probably less than 20% in the end.
Chief, I want to be sure I understand. The northern, we call it the southern border for us. I'll call it the northern border for Mexico. You're telling me the cartels are in control of the northern border, not the government of Mexico?
Our intelligence says that the cartels control the plazas, so the communities just south of the border.
Now, if the government of Mexico took back control of the northern border, would that help stem this tide?
I believe it would certainly have an impact, a positive impact.
Okay. Tell me again how you would change the asylum laws to solve this crisis.
Just ensuring when the credible fear claims, which basically if somebody just states that they have a fear of returning, we need to have more information, I guess, to make sure that it meets asylum at the border, because the standard for credible fear is much lower than the standard ultimately for asylum.
One of the things I've learned in life, and certainly in the 2.5 years since I've had the honor of serving in the Senate, is that you have to watch what people do, not what they say. What you do is what you believe, and everything else is just conversation. And I'm convinced that part of the problem, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but part of the problem we have here is, and let me preface this by saying this is America, you can believe what you want. But I think that some people now, some decision makers, some members of Congress have decided that illegal immigration is not illegal and should be illegal. And that illegal immigration is a moral good. I don't agree with that point of view. And that's why I think we have almost a fundamental disagreement. America admits more people into our country every year than any other country on the face of this earth. Do any of you know how many people we have welcomed into our country legally since Donald Trump became president? Anybody know?
Sir, that would be the refugee resettlement side of ORR. I don't have those exact numbers, but we're happy to get back to your staff just as soon as possible.
Senator Kennedy, are you asking about how many people have been naturalized?
I'm asking how many people, I'm still trying to digest Mr. Hayes's answer. Let me put it another way. What I'm asking is, how many people, since Donald J. Trump has been president, how many of our world citizens, world's neighbors, have been welcomed into our country illegally? And let me give you the answer. I don't need to wait on you, Mr. Hayes. 2.5 million. More than any other country on the face of the earth. So this isn't an issue of us hating immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. But I just find this breathtaking. Just absolutely breathtaking. We could fix this problem in 2 weeks if we wanted to, by changing the law, by designing a law that looks like somebody designed the damn thing on purpose. And it's an embarrassment to me that we don't even try. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blackburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I think we all agree that there is such an unbelievable crisis that is taking place on the border. And Chief, I was at the White House one day and you came in and spoke to us for a few minutes, and I appreciated your remarks and your honesty about the situations that are there. I've got a couple of questions. Director Asher, the judges, I know the president has had a directive. He wants these cases settled within 180 days, and you all have a backlog of 800,000 cases. And so talk to me for 30 seconds on what your needs are in order to try to meet this directive. It seems impossible to me.
Thank you, Senator. That's a great question. It is impossible. The system is broken. Good intention to have these cases heard, but again, unless the entire continuum together is allowed to grow resources by speeding up the process without all of the pieces needed for the process to be worked timely, it will fail. I can tell you that for every immigration judge that is needed to be hired, on the government side of things, specifically in ICE, I need 3 attorneys to work for every 1 immigration judge.
Okay, how long is it going to take you to put that infrastructure in place to even begin hearing the cases?
So we need funding because part of this
Well,
too
let's
is...
talk about timeline.
Okay,
because then I
timelines.
know we're going to have to get
Right.
the funding, but the timeline has to be done first.
That's without getting these direct hires, taking time to bring people on board, which includes my officers to do the management of the cases themselves. I mean, we're talking several months, if not a year. It's a colossal feat to accomplish.
Okay, so you're looking at a year of setup and infrastructure building in order to get to the cases. And the backlog continues to build that entire year. So am I correct on that?
It does. The non-detained, specifically the non-detained docket, it is at 800,000 today. It is growing anywhere between 4,000 and 8,000 new cases every week. Because simply, right, if we are releasing all of these family units into the interior, theoretically, they are being calendared for immigration hearings. We know that the majority of them do not show up. But just imagine, if I'm releasing with my component to date 168,000 family units since December 21st, and now Chief Provost has started to release family units as well, and I don't even remember what your number was, Chief.
Over 33,000.
Do the math there, ma'am, and we're talking several 100,000 of family
So you're
units.
looking at a docket
Growing
of
a docket.
1.5 million cases before you
To be
can
heard.
start.
Yes, ma'am, on a non-detained, yes.
Okay, that's helpful. Good information for us. Chief, I want to ask you, the new wall that is up down in San Diego,
Yes, Senator.
is this helping? Is it making it tougher? Is this the right type move? I think we're all frustrated with drugs that are flooding in. the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, this renting of children is heartbreaking. It is devastating. So is the wall helping out in San Diego?
It certainly helps. Everywhere that we have it, it helps, particularly right now as my manpower is spread extremely thin, being diverted to deal with the humanitarian issues, having a impedance and denial, and being able to then spread out the ability to come across in certain areas, particularly for smugglers, drug smugglers and such. It certainly helps my operations.
Let's see. Mr. Hayes, DHS and HHS have an agreement to share information on detainees. Is that correct?
On the sponsors, I believe, that you're asking about.
Yes, on the sponsors, not the children, but the sponsors.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Is that functioning as we would hope it should be functioning?
There are certain components of it. I believe you're referencing to the appropriations language that limits
Yes.
ICE's ability. I'd have to defer to ICE on the specifics of that. I do know from a purpose of determining sponsorship and how it affects the length of care, I don't think it's having a positive impact on the operation at ORR.
And ORR, your budget this year is how much?
It is, I know the initial appropriation was $1.3 billion. There's some additional monies in there in the transfer and reprogramming inside of
Have you all been
HHS.
able to get your fiscal house in order in the past 12 months?
I'm not sure I follow your
Are
question.
you filing your reports in a timely manner? ORR had a problem with that at one point, a couple of years ago.
I am aware of that. To the best of my knowledge, we are working very faithfully to submit any reports. If there are some that you are not seeing or would like access to, please let us know. We'll be happy to get that to you and your staff,
That is
ma'am.
wonderful. Thank you all very much for being here. Your information is helpful. We are grateful for your dedication and your service. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I have just a couple of two final questions. One is, Ms. Asher, maybe we'll start with you. What happens if one of the migrants who claims asylum, but then who's released into the interior of the United States, given a future court date, does not show up for their asylum hearing? Does the judge issue a deportation order as a result of that, and do they waive their asylum claim for not showing up in court?
Senator, that's correct. It's called an in absentia order, which that is the majority of I referenced the pilot that EOIR conducted with the family units. 87% of those individuals did not show up, so therefore an absentia order was rendered.
So am I correct in concluding that not only do people who don't have valid grounds for asylum show up in front of the immigration judge, that people who may have valid claims for asylum don't show up? And so we are basically harming people who may have a legitimate claim in front of an immigration judge based on our inability to deal with this volume of people and claims.
That's absolutely correct, sir. And that's yet another sort of tragedy to all of this, because good intention programs that are stood up, particularly individuals to claim credible fear, to ask for asylum, it is so wrought with fraud and just fraudulent claims that the individuals who truly have cases to be heard for consideration are lost in the volume and waiting for years perhaps to be heard, or just not showing up, and they're ending up in the same sort of predicament. So yes, the consequences of not showing up are absolutely detrimental to those who may have a claim.
Chief Provost, and maybe Ms. Asher, you talked about the volume of families coming across the border and the lack of detention facilities. I think I heard you say, Ms. Asher, that because of the increase in volume of single adults coming across, that you basically had to clear out the families from some of the detention facilities simply to take care of this increased volume in adults. Did I hear that correctly?
You did, sir. At our Carnes Family Residential Center, we had to close out holding families, and specifically, if I may add, at Carnes, we were holding male heads of household, but because of the surge of single adults, and in this case, we had this surge in helping on females. We had to make the operational decision to convert until further notice.
And Chief Provost, are these single adults, are they making asylum claims?
In Border Patrol custody of the apprehensions that we've had across the board, only about 8% of our apprehensions claim credible fear in our custody. Most of the claims are happening, I believe, in Ms. Asher's custody.
And so if you don't have the detention beds for single adults, what's your alternative?
The only alternative is what I said is my biggest fear, eventually having to release single adults, and if there is no consequence, we'll lose the border.
And by that you mean the pull factor based on the fact that the smugglers and the migrants have figured out how to game the system and successfully find themselves permanently in the United States? That's what you mean?
Certainly, if there is no consequence, then the numbers will grow dramatically. If single adults cannot be detained, then those numbers will grow dramatically, just as family units have grown dramatically.
And just to be clear, when you talk about consequences, is it important to have consequences to deter people from beginning the trip in the first place?
Certainly, if they know that they're going to be released, and that's part of the reason I think our credible fear claims, particularly with family units, are low. They don't have to claim credible fear. They know they're going to be released into the country.
Well, I want to thank each of you for being here today and enhancing our understanding of the challenge that you and we face. And frankly, I'm grateful to you for also placing the responsibility where it lies, and that's squarely at the feet of Congress. People can whistle past the graveyard. They can act like, well, this is not a big deal, or try to ignore it or be distracted by other issues. But I think you have done a good job of telling us what the facts are, and it's up to us, those of us in Congress who are elected to represent the people of the United States. It's our responsibility now to respond. And I can only hope that we will. We will leave the record open for, I guess, 7 days, for 1 week. There may be additional written questions that may come your way. I'm not sure there will be, but if there are, I hope you'll respond promptly, and then we'll close the record out in a week's time. But with that, let me thank each of you for your service, and thank you for being here today. We're adjourned.
Great seeing you, sir. Good job, Mr. Chairman.